I should have known the night was doomed the moment we pulled into my sister's driveway. The house was glowing with warm yellow light, the kind that looks inviting from the outside. But my stomach twisted anyway, warning me in ways I'd learned not to ignore. My husband parked the car carefully, hands resting on the steering wheel for a moment. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the front door like it was a test. I watched his jaw tighten, that tiny tell that most people would miss. He used to make that same face before running into burning buildings. Now he made it before walking into my family's dining room. "Ready?" I asked, trying to sound lighter than I felt. He forced a small smile, the quiet, polite one he always used with them. "As I'll ever be," he said, voice steady but soft. He squeezed my hand before we stepped out of the car. He had faced collapsing roofs and walls of flame without flinching, but the thought of another family dinner still made his shoulders tense, and that, somehow, hurt more than anything else. Inside, the smell of roasted meat and garlic filled the air. Voices floated from the dining room, loud, overlapping, already half-arguing. My sister's laugh rang out first, sharp and theatrical as always. My mother's voice followed, carrying that familiar tone of thinly veiled criticism. I felt myself bracing for impact long before they even saw us. My husband stepped behind me slightly, letting me go first. He didn't want to be in the way, even in a hallway. "Finally," my sister said when we entered, stretching the word. "You're late," my mother added, not even looking at the clock. "We're right on time," I replied, forcing a smile. My husband greeted everyone politely, the way he always did. A few nods, a few half-hearted smiles came back his way. No one stood up to hug him. No one said, "We're glad you're here." They just went back to their conversations, like he was furniture. We sat down at the long table, the good dishes laid out. My mother always loved the performance of hosting, if not the guests themselves. She placed the serving bowls carefully, making sure everything looked perfect. Appearance had always mattered more than sincerity in this family. My husband pulled out my chair first, then sat beside me quietly. He reached for the water pitcher instead of wine. He never talked about how certain smells reminded him of smoke. But I noticed the way his eyes flickered whenever someone lit a candle. Across from us, my older brother was already halfway through his second drink. He smirked when he glanced at my husband, like an inside joke. A joke I was never sure I wanted to understand. "So," my brother said, dragging out the word lazily, "how's life on the sidelines?" He didn't say firehouse, didn't say station. He just let the insult hang there, disguised as curiosity. My husband answered the way he always did, calm, measured, respectful. "Busy," he said. "The community programs are growing fast." He was helping train young volunteers now, teaching fire safety in schools. He was working with rehab groups, speaking to survivors, mentoring new recruits. He was still deeply in it, just in a different uniform now. But to my family, anything that didn't involve a loud siren seemed lesser. My brother snorted and took a sip of his drink. "Right," he said, "motivational lectures and safety posters. Very heroic." My fork scraped against my plate harder than I meant it to. My husband pretended not to notice, but I saw his shoulders tighten. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. That was the worst part. He'd stopped trying a long time ago. He just swallowed the disrespect like it was something he deserved, and I hated that they made him feel that way. The conversation moved on without us for a while. Work talk, gossip, complaints about neighbors and bills. My family loved to hear themselves speak. They loved to complain about the system, politicians, taxes, everything. But they never lifted a finger to help anyone outside themselves. They liked safe topics, just edgy enough to sound interesting. Never vulnerable, never honest, never truly kind. My husband sat beside me, silent, hands resting loosely on his lap. From time to time, he'd glance at me and offer a faint smile, the kind that said, "I'm okay," even when he wasn't. I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried not to take the bait. I had promised him on the drive here I'd keep the peace, but my patience was already wearing thin, and we hadn't even reached the main course yet. I should have known it was only a matter of time. It started, like most things did in my family, with a careless joke. My uncle, red-faced from wine and always too loud, leaned back in his chair. He wiped his mouth with his napkin dramatically, preparing his performance. "So," he said, glancing at my husband with a smirk, "how does it feel to be, what do they call it?" He paused for effect, pretending to search for the word. "Ah, yes, a retired firefighter at your age." The word retired came out dripping with sarcasm. The table chuckled politely, like trained background noise. My chest tightened so hard it was painful. My husband's face didn't change, but his hand clenched slightly. He wasn't retired by choice. He was forced out by an injury that nearly killed him. And every time someone reduced that to a punchline, it tore him open again. But my uncle wasn't finished. "Back in my day," my uncle continued, tapping his chest proudly, "men didn't quit just because it got a little rough." He never mentioned his desk job, his air-conditioned office, his safe routine. To hear him talk, you'd think he'd lived in combat boots. My mother chuckled in that sharp, approving way she had. "He's always been too emotional," she added, looking at me instead of him. "Remember when he first got hurt? You cried for days." She said it like I'd been dramatic, not traumatized, like nearly losing my husband had been an inconvenience. My sister rolled her eyes, swirling her wine. "Honestly, you're better off now," she said to me. "At least he doesn't run into burning buildings anymore. Unless," she added, laughing, "he couldn't keep up anyway." The table erupted into soft, cruel laughter, and something inside me snapped. I set my fork down carefully so I wouldn't throw it. My hands shook anyway, burning with anger I had swallowed for too long. My husband glanced at me, a silent warning in his eyes. He wanted me to let it go, to survive the night quietly. But I had watched him survive too much already. Too many nights waking up gasping from nightmares, too many scars hidden beneath his shirt, too many appointments where doctors talked about his spine like machinery, too many moments when he stared at old photos of his crew, faces of men he'd run into flames with, some who never came back. Men my family would have called heroes, while calling him something else entirely. I took a deep breath, feeling the words rise anyway. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said quietly. The table fell silent just long enough to register the shift. My mother was the first to recover from the tension. "We're just joking," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're always so sensitive when it comes to him." She said him, like he was a burden I'd decided to carry. Not the man who had once run into a collapsing house to save a family. Not the man who had pulled a child from a smoke-filled bedroom. Not the man who had spent months learning to walk without a cane. "Besides," my mother added, spearing a piece of meat, "he could have gone back if he really wanted it." The lie hit like a slap. He had sat in that same hospital room with me, listening to doctors. Their voices were flat when they said another impact could paralyze him. He hadn't cried then. He just nodded, accepting the death of the life he loved, and my family twisted that into lack of effort. My brother smirked, leaning his elbow on the table. "Come on," he said. "It's not like he was chief or anything. Just another guy on the truck." He shrugged as if he were stating a harmless fact. My husband stared at his plate, jaw tightening again. He had never bragged about what he did. He didn't wear his old rank or stories like trophies. He kept his medals in a box in the closet. He always said the real honor was that he got to come home. I pressed my lips together, anger vibrating in my chest. "You weren't there that night," I finally said. "The one that ended his career." I looked at my brother, then my mother, then my uncle. You didn't see the roof collapsing over his head. The table grew still, but I wasn't sure they were listening yet. My uncle rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my attempt at seriousness. "We all have bad days at work," he said, shrugging. "That doesn't mean we stop showing up." Heat rushed to my face so quickly it made me dizzy. A bad day at work for him meant almost dying, I snapped. It meant not knowing if he'd walk again. My mother sighed as if I were being dramatic again. "There she goes," she muttered. "She's so emotional." My sister reached for the wine bottle, pouring herself more. "It's been years," she said. "Maybe it's time to move on." My husband shifted slightly, his eyes falling closed for a second. He wasn't asking for pity. He had made peace with his reality in ways they hadn't, but their refusal to acknowledge the cost still carved into him, and I was done watching it happen quietly. "So what does he do now anyway?" my uncle asked. The question was framed like curiosity, but reeked of judgment. "He works with the mayor's office," I said, "on fire safety initiatives and community preparedness." My uncle snorted again, unimpressed. "So, paperwork and workshops," he said, "from hero to hall monitor." The words came out with a smirk that twisted my stomach. My husband's hand tightened around his water glass. His knuckles turned white, but his voice stayed calm. "It's important work," he said quietly. "Prevention saves lives too," my brother chuckled, low and mocking. "Sure," he said, "if that helps you sleep at night." And that was when the doorbell rang. Everyone looked toward the front hallway, surprised. My sister frowned, wiping her hands on her napkin. "Is someone else coming?" she asked my mother. My mother shook her head, confused. "I didn't invite anyone else," she said. The doorbell rang again, insistently this time. My sister sighed and pushed back her chair. "Probably a neighbor," she muttered, heading for the hall. The rest of us sat in a strange, suspended silence. My husband stared at his plate like it was suddenly fascinating. He hated being the center of attention, even when he deserved it, especially when the attention came wrapped in ridicule. I reached under the table and squeezed his knee gently. He looked up at me, offering a tired half-smile. Then we all heard my sister gasp. Footsteps moved down the hallway slowly, accompanied by murmurs. My sister's voice carried a note I rarely heard, nervous respect. "Come in, please," she said. "They're just in here." My mother straightened in her chair, smoothing her blouse quickly. She always adjusted herself when anyone important walked in. I turned in my seat, curiosity rising above my frustration. When my sister stepped aside, I saw him, the mayor, our city's mayor, standing in my sister's dining room doorway, still in his work suit, tie slightly loosened from a long day. His eyes scanned the table before landing on my husband. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "There you are," the mayor said warmly. "I've been trying to reach you." The table went completely silent. My uncle's smug expression dissolved instantly. My brother straightened, suddenly interested. My mother pressed her lips together, uncertain whether to smile. My husband blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Mayor," he said, starting to stand. The mayor crossed the room quickly, waving off the formality. "Sit, sit," he said. "I won't take much of your time." He rested a hand on my husband's shoulder with easy familiarity. "I heard you were here with family tonight," he continued, "and I didn't want another day to pass without saying this." He glanced around the table, his gaze steady and sharp. "You all should know what this man has done for our city." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Heat rose in my throat, not from anger this time, but something else. For the first time all evening, my husband looked truly startled. The mayor took a breath, his voice growing more formal. "We're honoring him next week," he said simply. "A public ceremony to recognize his service and ongoing work. He saved lives in uniform," the mayor continued, "and he's still saving them now, in ways most people never see." The room felt suddenly too small for all the emotions inside it. My family stared at my husband like they were seeing him for the first time. The man they'd just laughed at. The man they'd called too emotional, weak, failed. The mayor's hand remained on his shoulder, solid and unwavering. "He's not a failed firefighter," the mayor said softly. "He's one of the finest this city has ever had." My husband swallowed hard, eyes shining in the dim light. And as I looked around that table, I knew one thing for sure. Nothing about this dinner would ever be the same again. The room stayed suspended in a strange, heavy silence after the mayor finished speaking. My family stared at my husband like he'd suddenly become someone they didn't know, someone important, someone respected, someone they weren't prepared to face honestly. My husband blinked slowly, trying to process the weight of the mayor's words. His shoulders rose and fell in one steady breath, grounding himself carefully. He wasn't used to being praised anymore, not in front of anyone, especially my family. He wasn't used to being seen beyond the injury that had reshaped his life. But when he finally lifted his gaze, he didn't look small or uncertain. He looked steady, humbled, but undeniably present. The mayor smiled at him as if they shared a private truth. And for the first time that evening, warmth spread through my chest. My husband wasn't shrinking under their judgment anymore. They were shrinking under the truth of him. They were finally seeing the man I'd always seen, and I hoped the moment would last long enough to change something. My mother recovered first, smoothing her blouse with nervous hands. She stepped forward, suddenly trying to look gracious and welcoming. "We're honored you came," she said, voice too sweet to be real. She shot a sharp glance at the table, silently demanding everyone behave. The hypocrisy of it burned through my patience. Moments ago, she'd been laughing at the jokes made at his expense. Now she acted like she had always believed in him. My husband didn't call her out. He never did. He just nodded politely, offering her a small, gentle smile. The mayor, however, seemed to catch the tension in the room instantly. He looked around, sharp but calm, reading the unspoken story. He stepped forward slightly, hand still resting on my husband's shoulder. "Well," he said, "I won't take much of your family time." The word family lingered in the air, tasting like irony. And I saw my sister's face pale just a little. My uncle shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat too loudly. He lifted his wine glass as though it could shield him from embarrassment. "So, what kind of ceremony is this?" he asked casually, but the attempt sounded forced, strained, painfully fake. The mayor smiled with the patience of someone who'd handled worse. "A recognition ceremony," he said simply, "for exceptional service and community impact." My uncle blinked, his bravado cracking at the edges. He looked at my husband with new, uneasy eyes, and I felt a bittersweet satisfaction rise in my chest. They had belittled him for years, dismissing his sacrifice. But now someone powerful, someone objective, had named the truth. My husband wasn't a failure. He was a survivor doing meaningful work, and nothing they said could undo that. My sister finally spoke, voice tight with forced curiosity. "So, the city really thinks his programs matter that much?" She sounded like she couldn't decide between denial and jealousy. The mayor nodded, expression confident and warm. "Absolutely. His work has saved more people than you realize." My sister blinked rapidly, thrown off balance by the praise. My mother clasped her hands tightly, smiling too wide. She was already rewriting the evening in her head, pretending they'd always supported him, always believed. But the truth hung heavy, exposed by their silence. My husband sat quietly, absorbing every unexpected turn. He wasn't smug. He never would be. He simply looked relieved, like a man finally allowed to breathe, like a man no longer carrying the burden of being misunderstood. The mayor glanced at me then, something knowing in his eyes, almost as if he understood what this night had really been, a battle fought without flames, but with wounds just as deep. He stepped back slightly, releasing my husband's shoulder. "I won't stay long," he said warmly, "but I wanted you to hear it directly from me." My husband shook his head gently, humbled. "You didn't have to come," he said softly. "I wanted to," the mayor replied without hesitation. "You deserve to be recognized, not quietly, not behind closed doors." The words felt like a balm settling over old scars. My husband lowered his gaze, emotion tightening his breath. He wasn't used to this kind of validation, but he received it with more grace than anyone at that table ever had, and I felt pride bloom inside me, fierce and tender. My brother finally found his voice, weak and uneven. "So, you're giving him an award?" he asked. His tone tried to sound neutral, but landed somewhere near disbelief. The mayor nodded again, unwavering. "We are, and we're grateful for the work he continues to do." My brother's jaw tensed, ego fracturing under truth. He'd always been competitive, measuring himself constantly. But tonight wasn't about him, and it stung. My husband didn't gloat, didn't look his way. He just sat still, absorbing the surreal moment. His calm only made the contrast sharper. Where others felt threatened, he felt humbled. Where others shrank, he simply existed with quiet dignity. And maybe that frightened them more than anything else, a man they couldn't belittle anymore. My sister tried to shift the mood with a brittle laugh. "Well, isn't this something?" she said lightly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her pride had been dented too deeply, too quickly. My mother reached across the table to rearrange a napkin. She only did that when she felt cornered. "It's wonderful," she said too brightly. "We always knew he'd find his path." The lie stung with familiar sharpness. My husband didn't correct her. He rarely corrected anyone. He just nodded, graceful even in discomfort. His humility contrasted painfully with their performative kindness. And suddenly, I felt exhausted. Exhausted by years of minimizing him. Exhausted by their selective memory. The mayor glanced at the table again, gauging the tension. He cleared his throat softly, regaining the room's attention. "I'll let you enjoy your evening," he said, "but before I go, I want to say one last thing." Everyone straightened instinctively, waiting. He turned fully toward my husband, voice low and sincere. "You made this city safer, not once, but continuously. You achieved what many never could." My husband's throat worked, unable to form words. "Healing is also a form of courage," the mayor added, "and you've shown more of it than most people will ever know." The silence that followed was not hostile this time. It was reverent, almost tender, a truth finally spoken aloud, a truth none of them could deny. My husband finally exhaled, a shaky, quiet breath. "Thank you," he whispered, voice thick with sincerity. The mayor smiled, nodding once with quiet respect. He extended his hand, and my husband rose to shake it. It was a simple gesture, but it carried so much weight, recognition, validation, honor, things my family had refused to offer him for years. The handshake lingered for a moment, firm and steady. Then the mayor stepped back, preparing to leave. "I'll see you next week," he said warmly. "We're proud of you." My husband swallowed hard, blinking away emotion. I felt tears sting behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from a long-awaited sense of justice. The mayor walked toward the door, my sister trailing behind him awkwardly. My mother stood half-risen, unsure whether to bow or wave. My uncle lifted his wineglass in stiff, belated respect. My husband remained on his feet, hands trembling slightly. He didn't hide it. He didn't need to anymore. I reached for his hand, interlacing our fingers gently. His grip tightened, grounding himself in my touch. For the first time all evening, He looked at ease. He looked taller somehow, not physically but emotionally, lighter, freer, no longer weighed down by their judgments. The mayor paused in the doorway, offering one last nod. "Take care," he said softly. Then he stepped out, leaving the room flooded with quiet, a quiet my family didn't know how to fill, a quiet that belonged to truth. My sister returned to the dining room slowly, her face flushed with embarrassment and forced composure. She took her seat without a word, eyes avoiding mine. My mother sat down next, posture stiff and thoughtful. My uncle cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at my husband. No one picked up their utensils. No one resumed their conversations. The laughter from earlier now felt cruel and distant. A ghost of their arrogance lingered in the air. My husband sank back into his chair, chest rising deeply. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't gloating. He simply looked peaceful. For the first time in years at this table, and watching him, I felt my own heart settle, like we'd both stepped into a new chapter we finally deserved. My mother finally spoke, voice soft and uneven. "Well," she said, "that was unexpected." Her tone carried something unfamiliar, not sarcasm, not superiority, something closer to humility, maybe even guilt. She looked at my husband for the first time without dismissing him. My sister swallowed hard, eyes flicking his way. My uncle shifted uncomfortably, face flushed. My brother stared at his plate, jaw clenched tight. And I realized something quietly monumental. They were all re-evaluating him. They were all forced to confront their own cruelty. The truth had entered the room and rearranged every dynamic. And it was about time. My husband didn't speak right away. He just sat with his hands folded, breathing steadily. He wasn't waiting for their apologies. He wasn't demanding anything, but the silence around him felt like a door opening, a doorway into long-needed accountability. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes met mine. Warm, strong, soft. He whispered, "You okay?" Even after everything they said to him, he was still checking on me. I felt my throat close with emotion. I nodded, squeezing his hand, and in that moment, everything shifted again. Dinner resumed slowly, awkwardly, quietly. No more jokes, no more jabs, no more belittling or mockery disguised as humor. Instead, there was caution, the careful kind that comes after being proven wrong. My husband answered questions gently when they came, not from defensiveness, but from a renewed sense of worth. My mother tried to sound supportive, though clumsily. My uncle muttered compliments that barely sounded like compliments. My brother offered a stiff nod of acknowledgement. My sister avoided confrontation entirely, and the strangest part was this. For the first time, none of it mattered, not compared to what the mayor had said. When dessert was served, my husband leaned toward me. "Thank you," he whispered so softly no one else heard. I frowned slightly, confused. "For what?" He took a slow, steady breath. "For standing with me," he said. "For believing in me when they didn't." His voice wavered just enough to reveal the depth beneath it. My chest ached with love and anger and relief all at once. "You never needed their approval," I whispered, "but you always deserved their respect." He looked down, swallowing emotion, and then he whispered something that broke me differently. I didn't expect tonight to heal something in me, and I realized it had healed something in me too. When we finally stood to leave, something astonishing happened. My mother walked us to the door, wringing her hands nervously. She touched my husband's arm, hesitant but sincere. "We're proud of you," she said quietly. The words stunned me into stillness. My husband blinked, startled but polite. "Thank you," he said gently. My uncle offered a handshake, awkward but earnest. My sister hugged me quickly, eyes lingering on him with new respect. My brother muttered, "Congrats," voice tight but genuine. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to erase the past. But it was a beginning, a shift, a crack of light where there had only been walls. As we walked to the car, the cool night air wrapped around us. My husband released a long breath he'd been holding for years. He leaned against the car door, eyes closed, grounding himself slowly. "You okay?" I asked softly, touching his arm. He nodded, though tears glimmered behind his lashes. "I didn't know I needed that," he whispered. His voice trembled, revealing pieces he rarely showed. "But I guess I needed to hear it." He lifted his gaze toward the house we'd just left, not with resentment, but with a quiet, steady truth. "They finally saw me," he said softly. "Not who I used to be, but who I am now." We drove home in comfortable silence, our hands intertwined. Streetlights blurred past the windows, soft and golden. My husband stared ahead, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years, not pretending, not performing strength, just existing in a moment where the world had finally softened. He glanced at me once, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you for tonight," he said quietly. But the gratitude wasn't for the dinner. It was for standing beside him through the darkest parts, for believing in him louder than their doubts, for helping him rebuild piece by piece. And in that quiet car, beneath the warmth of passing lights, I realized something else entirely. The healing had only just begun. The house felt different when we stepped inside that night. Not louder, not brighter, just different, as if the air had shifted. My husband closed the door gently behind us, still quiet from the drive. He slipped off his shoes, exhaling slowly as if releasing years of tension. I watched him undo his jacket and rest it over the chair back. He moved with a kind of gentleness I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the gentleness of exhaustion, the gentleness of someone finally relieved. He stood still for a moment, hands on the counter. Then he whispered, "I feel strange." "Good strange or bad strange?" I asked softly. He thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Good," he said, like something heavy finally let go. His voice trembled just enough to show the truth, and that truth settled inside me warmly. We sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the room. My husband traced a slow line across the wood grain with one finger. It was something he did when he was processing emotions deeply. "I didn't expect the mayor to say those things," he said. His voice held awe, confusion, relief all at once. "I didn't expect anyone to defend me, not like that." He shook his head, still stunned by the evening. "I thought my career was something to hide," he admitted. "Something painful people didn't want to talk about." I leaned forward, resting my hand over his. "You never had anything to hide," I whispered. He swallowed hard, blinking slowly. "I know that now," he said quietly. "But for a long time, I didn't." The honesty of it hit me deep. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, streetlights cast soft halos across the pavement. "Did you see their faces?" he asked suddenly. There was no resentment in his tone, just revelation. "They didn't know what I've been doing all this time." "No," I said, "because they never asked." He nodded, absorbing that truth with a slow breath. "They assumed the worst," he murmured. He didn't say it angrily, just matter of fact, like someone sorting through memories that finally made sense. "For years," he continued, "I thought maybe they were right, that I lost everything that made me, me." He rubbed his hands together slowly, grounding himself. "But tonight, someone finally said otherwise, and it felt like someone turned a light back on." He stood and walked toward the sink, pacing gently. The pacing wasn't anxious, more like reflection in motion. "You know what hurt the most?" he asked quietly. "It wasn't the jokes or the judgment. It was believing them, even a little." His voice cracked softly at the edges. I let their opinions settle into me like truth. He rested his palms on the counter, breathing deeply. But tonight, the truth was louder than their voices. He turned toward me, eyes shining but steady, and I finally heard it. I walked to him slowly and placed a hand on his back. He leaned into the touch without hesitation. It felt like holding someone finally stepping out of the dark, someone ready to see himself clearly again. We moved to the living room, settling onto the couch. The room glowed softly under the warm lamplight. He sank into the cushions, letting his body relax fully. "I didn't expect healing to come like this," he said, "not through a ceremony. Not through a speech, but through being seen." His words struck something deep inside me. Recognition had always meant more to him than applause. He didn't want trophies. He wanted truth. And tonight had finally offered that truth freely. He rested his arm along the back of the couch. "When he said, 'I'd saved lives after leaving the department,'" he paused, emotion tightening his throat. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." His voice broke softly, and I held his hand again. He turned slightly toward me, expression vulnerable and open. "I was so afraid my best years were behind me," he confessed. His honesty felt like a breath of warm air. "I thought I was a shadow of who I used to be. But maybe I've just changed." His eyes softened, studying my face with gratitude. "You never treated me like I was less," he said. "I hope you know that." I smiled gently, brushing his cheek with my thumb. "You were never less," I whispered. "You were hurting, and healing takes time." He closed his eyes briefly, letting the words settle. When he opened them again, they were clearer, calmer. "You always held the pieces before I could," he said, and I felt something inside me ache tenderly. He leaned his head back, the tension draining slowly. "You know what surprised me the most?" he asked softly. "That they listened," I answered. He shook his head gently. "That they looked ashamed." There was no cruelty in his tone, just truth. "For once," he continued, "they realized the weight of their words. And that alone felt like a kind of justice. He didn't want revenge. He never had. He wanted acknowledgement, honesty, understanding. And tonight, even if imperfectly, he received it." "I don't expect them to change overnight," he said, "but maybe tonight crack something open." He breathed in deeply, then exhaled softly. "And I can live with that." We spent a while in comfortable silence, the kind that fills the room like warm light. My husband rested his head on the back of the couch. His body looked lighter than it had in months. He wasn't performing strength. He was simply at ease. He reached for my hand again, threading our fingers together. Can I tell you something?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Of course," I said, leaning closer. "I didn't go tonight to impress them," he said. "I went because you asked me to try." His thumb brushed my knuckles gently. "And I'm grateful you did." My chest tightened with emotion. "I just wanted them to see the truth," I whispered. "Do you think they did?" he asked quietly. I thought about the way their faces shifted, the shock, the guilt, the discomfort, the recognition. "Yes," I said, maybe for the first time. He nodded slowly, accepting the possibility with care. "Then maybe it was worth the pain," he murmured. I shook my head gently, lifting his chin. "You should never have been their punching bag," I said. He looked down, but not in shame, just reflection. "I know," he whispered, "but it shaped me too." "Pain changes you," I said softly, "but so does truth." He smiled faintly. eyes softening with gratitude. And tonight, truth finally won. His voice was steadier now, anchored. He shifted closer, leaning against me. His warmth pressed into my shoulder softly. "I wish the guys could have seen tonight," he whispered. "The ones I lost, the ones who kept me going." His voice softened into something fragile. "They always told me I mattered, and for a while, I forgot that." He swallowed hard, emotion thickening his tone. "I wish I could tell them I'm okay now." I rested my hand on his chest, over his heartbeat. "You are," I said gently. "Not perfect, not done healing, but okay." A shaky breath escaped him. "That's enough," he whispered, and I felt him settle against me fully. The clock ticked softly from across the room. My husband's breathing grew slower, calmer. His head dropped to my shoulder, peaceful and trusting. For a moment, the weight of the world felt far away. He wasn't a failed firefighter in this room. He wasn't a man defined by injury or judgment. He was simply himself, gentle, strong, flawed, healing, human. And in that moment, he seemed to accept that too. "I'm proud of who I'm becoming," he whispered. The words were soft, almost shy, but they carried the power of transformation. I closed my eyes, holding him closer, and whispered back, "So am I." We eventually moved to the bedroom, exhaustion settling in. Not the heavy exhaustion of grief, the warm one that follows emotional release. My husband sat on the edge of the bed, hands on his knees. He stared at the floor for a long moment, thoughtful and calm. "I'm not afraid of tomorrow," he said suddenly. The simplicity of it struck me deeply. "There was a time I couldn't say that," he admitted, "when the future felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost." He lifted his gaze to mine gently. "But now, I think I'm ready for whatever comes next." His voice steadied with quiet confidence. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. And the truth suited him beautifully. He lay down beside me, the mattress dipping softly. He turned on his side, facing me fully. His eyes held a softness I hadn't seen in ages. "I don't feel broken tonight," he whispered. The admission made my eyes sting instantly. "You never were," I said. He smiled, small and real, touching my cheek lightly. "Maybe not," he whispered. "But tonight, I feel whole again." His hand slid into mine, fingers warm and steady, the kind of steady that comes after storms, the kind that comes after truth is spoken aloud. I leaned forward and kissed his forehead gently. He breathed out, peaceful and deep, and sleep found him faster than it had in years. I stayed awake a little longer, watching him rest. His expression was soft, free of tension, a man no longer haunted by judgment, a man finally stepping into healing without fear. I brushed my thumb across his hand slowly, grateful, proud, awed by his quiet resilience. Tonight had offered something more powerful than vindication. It had offered recognition, truth, dignity, and those things rebuild a soul faster than forgiveness ever could. I turned off the bedside lamp, the room dimming gently. The silence felt warm around us, restful and safe. I whispered into the darkness, "You're not done becoming yet." Then I closed my eyes beside him and let peace wrap around us both. The morning sunlight slid gently across our bedroom walls, soft and golden. My husband stirred beside me, stretching slowly, as if waking from years of wait. For the first time in so long, his face looked peaceful in the early quiet. No lines of tension, no restless shadows beneath his eyes, just a man rediscovering how to breathe without fear. He blinked toward the window, smiling faintly. "Morning," he murmured, voice warm and steady. There was a softness in him I hadn't seen in years. Not weakness, never that, but the softness of someone who finally believed he deserved peace. I touched his arm gently, letting my thumb skim his skin. He leaned into the gesture with a grateful sigh. "It feels different today," he whispered, and I knew exactly what he meant. Some part of him had finally begun to heal. We made breakfast together in the kitchen, moving in quiet harmony. He cracked eggs while I sliced fruit, the morning sun bright across the counter. Every small motion felt warm, domestic, deeply human. He hummed under his breath, a habit he'd lost after the injury. I didn't point it out. I just let the music settle around us like a soft blessing. When he slid the plate toward me, he smiled genuinely, not forced, not polite, real, warm, alive. "Feels like a fresh start," he said, sitting across from me. I nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in my chest. He lifted his coffee mug, studying it thoughtfully. "You know, I didn't realize how much I needed last night." "It was overdue," I replied softly. He smiled with gratitude I felt in my bones. But healing is rarely linear, and peace rarely uninterrupted. Halfway through breakfast, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it casually, then froze. His face shifted in a way I recognized instantly. Not fear, not dread, but something heavier. Something that carried the weight of unfinished stories. He turned the phone around so I could see the name. It was an old colleague from the station. Someone he hadn't heard from in months, maybe a year. My breath hitched as I watched him hesitate. He wasn't avoiding the man. He was avoiding the world tied to that name, the world he'd lost, the world that broke him before it rebuilt him. "Should I answer?" he asked softly. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to," I said, "but you can." He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself. Then he exhaled and answered the call. "Hey," he said quietly. His tone carried warmth layered with caution. There was a pause on the other end, long, heavy. Then his colleague's voice cracked through the speaker. "Man, I didn't know how to reach you," he said. The tone held urgency, sorrow, and something unsteady. My stomach tightened as I listened. This wasn't a casual call. This was news, and I feared it wasn't good. My husband's body went still, tense, but grounded. "What's going on?" he asked carefully. His colleague hesitated, a silence thick enough to suffocate. Then the truth came in a low, broken whisper. "It's about Captain Harris." My husband stiffened instantly, breath catching. The name alone carried years of history. Harris had been his mentor, his friend, his anchor in the chaos. A man who taught him courage long before injury, taught him humility. My heart thudded painfully as I watched my husband pale. "He's gone," the voice continued shakily. The words dropped like a stone in still water. My husband's hand tightened around his phone. What happened?" he whispered. His voice was thin and painfully human. The answer came slowly, weighted with grief. "Heart attack. Last night. In his sleep." My husband closed his eyes, shoulders collapsing inward. His breath faltered, trembling softly. "He was fine," he whispered. "I talked to him 2 weeks ago." Grief doesn't always come with warning. Sometimes it bursts through the door without knocking. His colleague inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. "I'm sorry, man. I know you two were close." My husband nodded, though the man couldn't see him. A quiet, breaking sound escaped his lips, the kind of sound someone makes only when love and loss collide. I reached for him immediately, placing my hand over his. He didn't pull away. They spoke for another minute, details, arrangements, the funeral date. My husband's responses grew softer, smaller, more strained, but he stayed present, stayed respectful, stayed steady. When he finally hung up, he set the phone down carefully, as if dropping it would shatter something inside him. His eyes stared ahead, unfocused and wet. Grief layered itself across his face like old smoke. I moved beside him, wrapping my arms around his shoulders. He leaned into the embrace slowly, like falling into memory. He didn't cry loudly, he never did. But tears slipped down his cheeks quietly, and I held him as his world shifted again. "I should have been there," he whispered into my shoulder. The guilt came fast. Familiar, corrosive, undeserved. "You couldn't have been," I said gently. "But I should have," he repeated, voice cracking. "He taught me everything, and I wasn't there." He wasn't talking about last night. He was talking about years of absence, years of distance. Distance created not by choice, but by trauma, injury, forced retirement, grief too heavy to carry. "He understood," I whispered softly. "He always understood." My husband closed his eyes, letting the pain wash through him. "He was proud of you," I added, and I meant it with every beat of my heart. He pulled away slightly, wiping his face with his sleeve. His breathing steadied, though grief still clung to him. "I need to see the guys," he said softly. There was a steadiness in his voice, not avoidance, not denial, just quiet resolve. I nodded instantly. "Whatever you need," I said. He reached for my hand, squeezing it as if anchoring himself. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he paused, looking down at the table. "I thought last night brought closure," he murmured. "But maybe it was preparing me for this." His tone held sorrow and clarity intertwined. We sat in silence for a long moment, our hands intertwined. The world felt heavier, dimmer, rearranged by unexpected loss. But beneath the grief, I sensed something else, a thread of strength running through him. Not denial, not forced optimism, just resilience waking up inside him again. He lifted his head slowly, meeting my eyes. "I need to say goodbye properly," he said softly, "and I need to see them not as who I was, but as who I am now." His words carried depth, maturity, and a kind of courage. I nodded, feeling warmth bloom through the ache. "You can," I whispered. "You're ready." And he was. He stood, moving with a mixture of heaviness and purpose. He grabbed his jacket, pausing as memories flickered behind his eyes. Then he straightened his shoulders, not in defiance, but in honor. "I'll go to the station first," he said, "then figure out the rest." I stepped closer, smoothing the collar of his jacket. He closed his eyes briefly under my touch. "You don't have to do this alone," I whispered. He opened his eyes, gratitude softening his expression. "I know," he said, "and that makes all the difference." He kissed my forehead gently, lingering in the warmth. Then he stepped toward the door with quiet bravery. A man walking toward grief, but not breaking under it. As he left, I watched him through the window, his silhouette small against the morning light, not fragile, not defeated, just human, deeply, profoundly human. I pressed my fingertips to the glass, feeling both love and sorrow ache in my chest. Every chapter of healing seemed to come with its own test. Last night, it had been dignity reclaimed. Today, it was grief revisited. And tomorrow, who knew what tomorrow would hold? But one thing I knew with absolute certainty, he would face it with grace. And I would walk beside him always. Because healing is not a straight line, it is a journey of heart after heart, truth after truth. The fire station looked smaller than I remembered as we pulled into the parking lot. My husband sat in the passenger seat quietly, hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't asked me to come, but he didn't stop me when I insisted. There was a heaviness around him, heavy but steady, like controlled fire. The sun reflected off the red doors, familiar and almost painful. I watched his eyes soften with a mix of grief and nostalgia. "This place raised me," he whispered quietly. His voice cracked just enough to betray the truth. I placed my hand over his, grounding him gently. "You're allowed to grieve here," I murmured. He nodded, swallowing hard, breath trembling. He opened the door slowly, stepping out into the crisp air. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the old building, a sanctuary and a battlefield all in one, a place where parts of him still lived. We walked toward the entrance together, his pace measured and slow. Every step seemed to pull memories out of the concrete. Voices, alarms, laughter, loss, echoes of a life he once lived so fully. He paused at the door, letting his fingers brush the worn metal. "They repainted," he whispered softly, almost to himself. Then he took a breath and pushed it open. The familiar smell of smoke, soap, and old gear filled the air. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the scent wash over him. It hit him like a memory to the chest, not hurting him, just grounding him deeply. I stood beside him, watching his posture shift. He wasn't shrinking, he wasn't trembling, he was coming home in a way he hadn't in years. Inside, everything felt both familiar and distant. The crew's boots lined the wall in precise rows, jackets hung from hooks, heavy and ready. The quiet hum of the compressor echoed from the back room. My husband stepped forward slowly, absorbing every detail. Then voices drifted from around the corner, low at first, then growing louder as footsteps approached. A group of firefighters turned into the hallway and froze. Their eyes widened the moment they recognized him. Emotion rippled across their faces like shockwaves. "My God," one of them whispered, "is that—" My husband lifted a hand in a quiet greeting, and the silence broke all at once. "Brother!" They rushed toward him, gripping his shoulders, pulling him into hugs. Strong arms wrapped around him, patting his back firmly, laughter mixed with grief in the air. Raw, real, unfiltered. I stepped back, letting them surround him the way they once had. "We thought you wouldn't come," one said, voice cracking. Another shook his head, wiping at his eyes. "Harris would have wanted you here," he added softly. My husband's jaw tightened, grief flickering inside him. "I had to be," he whispered. His voice wavered, but he didn't look away. They embraced him again, tighter this time, like brothers holding on to someone they almost lost twice. I watched his shoulders relax under their touch. Watched him become part of something again, something he thought he'd lost forever. One of the younger guys approached me, recognizing my face. "You brought him," he said softly. His eyes carried gratitude, heavy and sincere. I nodded, feeling emotion rise in my throat. "He needed to come home," I said. The young firefighter swallowed hard. "He saved me once," he whispered. I blinked, taken by surprise. "When I froze during training, he pulled me out." He looked toward my husband with reverence. "He's a legend here, still is." My heart tightened as I absorbed that truth. This station remembered him not as broken, but as extraordinary, as family. My family never understood that, but here he was seen. The captain on duty approached us then, older and steady. He shook my husband's hand firmly, both men's eyes glistening. "We lost a good one," the captain murmured. My husband nodded, voice trembling. "He taught me everything," he whispered. The captain placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "And he was proud of you. Don't you ever doubt that." My husband inhaled sharply, absorbing the weight of those words. "He talked about you," the captain continued softly, "even after you left. Said you were still saving people." My husband looked down, overwhelmed. "He said that every chance he got," the captain replied. And my husband broke, quietly, beautifully, honestly. They led us into the common room, where photos lined the wall. crews from years past, arms around each other, soot-streaked and smiling. My husband's face appeared in several frames, younger, laughing, fearless, alive. He stopped in front of one particular photo. He and Harris stood side by side, grins wide, arms slung over shoulders. A moment frozen in a world that no longer existed. My husband touched the frame lightly, thumb trembling. "He was the kind of leader who made you better," he whispered. The room quieted around him, listening. "He believed in me when I didn't," he added softly. A tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. I wish I'd told him that more. Pain and love mingled in his voice. Raw, honest, true. One of the older firefighters stepped beside him. "You told him every day," he said gently. "Not with words. With how you showed up." My husband closed his eyes tightly, absorbing the comfort. This man wasn't offering platitudes. He was offering truth forged in fire and brotherhood. "You were his success story," the man continued softly. "You walked through hell and came back standing." My husband shook his head slightly, emotion choking him. "I didn't always stand," he whispered. The older man smiled sadly. "Falling doesn't erase courage," he said. "It proves you were willing to face the flames." My husband looked away, tears spilling freely. He let them fall without shame. They guided him to the lockers, the old row where he once stood. His name still sat on the metal plate, untouched by time. My breath caught at the sight of it, so did his. He touched the name with trembling fingers, reverent and stunned. "They never replaced it," I whispered. "They wouldn't," one firefighter said firmly. "He earned that space." My husband's shoulders shook as a deep breath escaped him. He leaned his forehead against the locker gently, not in weakness, in reverence, in grief, in love. Silence wrapped around him, thick and sacred. No one rushed him. No one judged him. They simply stood with him, honoring what he'd given. The funeral arrangements were discussed quietly after that. Times, schedules, the service, the honor guard. My husband listened carefully, nodding at every detail. He wasn't detached. He was present in the deepest way. He asked what he could do, where he could help. The captain shook his head gently. "Just show up," he said. "That's all anyone wants." My husband nodded, swallowing emotion. "I'll be there," he promised. His voice held steady strength beneath the sorrow. I reached for his hand again, threading our fingers. He squeezed back tightly, grounding himself. He was grieving, yes, but not collapsing, not alone. As we prepared to leave, the crew gathered around him again. Hugs, handshakes, shoulder pats, murmured condolences, not pity, respect, deep, unwavering respect. One of them pressed a folded patch into his hand, Harris's old station patch. My husband stared at it, breath catching painfully. "He'd want you to have it," the firefighter said. My husband nodded, voice gone entirely. He tucked the patch carefully into his jacket pocket, like carrying a final piece of his mentor with him, like carrying permission to keep healing. We walked out together, the station watching him go. They didn't see a broken man. They saw a brother returning home. Outside, he paused beside the car, hand over his heart. He breathed deeply, letting the cold air steady him. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were red but clear. "I thought coming here would break me," he whispered, "but it didn't." I nodded, stepping closer, brushing his sleeve gently. He took my hand, holding it tightly. "It reminded me of who I was," he said softly, "and who I still am." Pride and grief twined together in his voice. "I lost so much when I left," he continued, "but maybe I didn't lose everything." He looked back at the station one last time. "I'll carry him with me," he whispered, "and keep doing the work he believed in." We drove home in quiet reflection, the world soft around us. My husband held the patch in his hands the whole way, turning it gently, tracing the edges like something sacred. He didn't cry anymore. He simply breathed, accepting the truth with grace. He had loved deeply, lost deeply, lived deeply, and now he was learning to heal deeply too. When we pulled into the driveway, he squeezed my hand again. "Thank you for being here," he whispered. His voice held exhaustion and gratitude intertwined. "I wouldn't have made it through today without you." I leaned toward him, pressing my forehead to his. "You were never alone," I murmured, "and you never will be." He closed his eyes, letting the truth settle, and together we stepped into whatever came next. The days leading up to the funeral moved strangely, heavy but fast. Time didn't feel linear. It felt like waves rolling in and out. Some moments stretched on forever, others vanished before I could catch them. My husband moved through the house with a quiet focus. He fixed small things that didn't need fixing, wiped already clean counters. Grief made him restless, but not destructive. He wanted everything in order before saying goodbye. Occasionally, I'd find him staring at the folded patch on the table. His thumb would trace its edges like a worn prayer. He didn't talk about what it meant, but he didn't have to. The love in his eyes spoke more loudly than words. At night, he slept lightly. But he slept. No thrashing, no nightmares ripping him awake in a panic, just a man carrying loss with as much grace as he could. And I watched him do it with a kind of stunned admiration. The morning of the funeral arrived cold and grey, clouds hanging low. It felt like the sky understood what the day required. My husband dressed in silence, each movement careful and deliberate. He chose a dark suit, simple and clean, nothing flashy. He pinned a small Firefighter emblem to his lapel without a word. When he held Harris's patch in his hand, his fingers shook. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket, over his heart. "Close enough," he murmured quietly. I pretended not to hear, but the words burned into me. I smoothed the front of his suit, straightening the fabric slowly. He let me fuss over him, not out of vanity, but grounding. "You don't have to come," he said softly, meeting my eyes. "I'm not letting you go through this alone," I replied. Something in his shoulders loosened at that. "Then we go together," he whispered. The church was already half full when we arrived. Rows of uniforms lined the pews, caps held respectfully in steady hands. The smell of polished wood and faint incense filled the air. My husband stood at the doorway for a moment, taking everything in. He wasn't just walking into a service, he was walking into a chapter closing. I slipped my arm through his, feeling his muscles tense and release. Heads began to turn as people noticed him. Whispers rustled briefly, not cruel, just surprised and sorrowful. Some faces lit up with recognition, others softened with empathy. A few of the older firefighters stepped forward to clasp his shoulder. "Glad you're here," one said quietly. "Wouldn't be right without you," another added. My husband nodded, voice failing him, but his eyes said enough. We found our seats near the front, close to the family. Every breath felt like walking over glass, and yet forward was the only direction. The casket sat at the front, draped in a flag, flowers framing it gently. Seeing it made everything real in a way nothing else had. My husband's fingers tightened around mine, his grip almost painful. I didn't pull away. I let him hold on as hard as he needed. Photos of Harris rested on easels nearby, showing him through the years. Young and fierce, older and wise, always with that same steady gaze. My husband stared at one particular photo, a familiar ache in his eyes. It was the two of them again, smiling like they had conquered fire itself. I could almost feel him slipping back into that moment. For a heartbeat, I saw the younger version of him in his posture, hungry, hopeful, brave to the edge of reckless. Then the organ music began, low and solemn, pulling us all back. The room settled into a respectful hush, grief thick in the air. The ceremony had started, and there was no more delaying the goodbye. My husband straightened his back, a quiet warrior in a borrowed battlefield. Speeches began with the chaplain, his voice practiced but sincere. He talked about service, sacrifice, duty, and faith, words that can sound cliché until they're wrapped around someone you loved. Then came fellow captains, sharing stories from years on the job. Laughter rippled through the room at moments, soft and bittersweet. Tears followed just as easily, blurring the edges of everything. My husband listened intently, his gaze fixed on the casket. He didn't move much, but every story carved another line into his heart. When they mentioned the fire that nearly took him too, I felt him flinch. The chaplain called it a miracle of survival and loss intertwined. My husband swallowed hard, jaw clenching, eyes shining. They spoke of how Harris had fought to keep his crew safe that night, how he never stopped checking in on them, even years later. My husband's lips parted as if to say something, then closed again. His grief sat between his ribs like a second heartbeat. Then the captain from the station stepped up to the podium. His voice was rough, the kind that comes from smoke and shouting. "Harris wasn't just our captain," he began, eyes sweeping the room. "He was the kind of man who built men instead of breaking them." A murmur of agreement moved like a wave through the pews. "He saw potential where others saw problems," the captain continued. My husband shifted slightly, eyes locked on the speaker, and he believed in second chances even when the world didn't. The captain's gaze landed on my husband for a beat longer than usual. It said more than any name could have in that moment. "He never forgot his people," the captain added, "even the ones who had to leave the job before they were ready." My husband's shoulders trembled once, then steadied. I felt his hand tighten around mine again, anchoring himself. He was hearing what he already knew, but this time out loud. When the captain finished, there was a pause, heavy and open. Then the chaplain cleared his throat and looked toward our row. "There's someone else who asked to speak," he said gently. My stomach dropped, and my heart jumped at the same time. The chaplain's eyes rested on my husband. "If you're ready," he added softly. My husband inhaled sharply, the breath sounding louder to me than anything. He looked at me, question and fear flickering behind his eyes. I nodded once, no words needed. His grief wasn't something to hide. His story had always been part of this room. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his suit with trembling hands. Every eye in the church followed his movement. He walked toward the front like a man carrying both loss and gratitude. And I realized this wasn't just a goodbye. It was a reclaiming. He stood behind the podium, fingers curling briefly around its edge. For a heartbeat, he said nothing, just looked at the casket. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. He cleared his throat once, steadying his voice before it broke. "I thought I'd left this world behind," he began quietly. Just those words made the room lean forward to listen. "But Harris never left me behind," he continued. "He called. He checked in. He reminded me I still mattered." A few heads bowed, others nodded sadly in agreement. "When I got hurt, I thought I'd failed him," he said. "Failed the job, failed myself." His voice trembled on the last word, but didn't stop. "But he never treated me like a failure," he added. "He treated me like a man still capable of doing good." Every sentence sounded like a brick being lifted off his chest. He rested both hands on the podium, grounding himself as he continued. "He told me healing wasn't weakness," he said softly. "It was a different kind of courage." The room fell still, everyone listening with raw attention. "I didn't believe him at first," he admitted. "I thought stepping away meant I wasn't enough anymore." His shoulders tightened, remembering the years swallowed by doubt. But Harris kept reminding me that bravery doesn't end with a uniform. My breath caught at the truth of it. He lifted his gaze, looking at the faces that had once been his world. "And he was right," he whispered, voice steadying. "He showed me there's more than one way to save a life." Silence wrapped around him like a warm shield, and grief settled into something gentler, something whole, something that finally made room for healing. He glanced down at the casket again, expression softening. "I didn't get to tell him thank you," he said quietly. "But I hope he knew." A single tear slid down his cheek, falling onto the wood of the podium. He didn't wipe it away, didn't hide from it. He let himself be fully human in front of everyone who mattered. "I owe him my life," he continued, voice trembling. "Not because he saved me from a fire, but because he saved me from giving up on myself." A murmur of emotion rippled through the room. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. They were witnessing not just grief, but truth, and truth has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. He took a shaky breath, gathering himself. "Goodbye, Captain," he whispered. "You left me better than you found me." He stepped back from the podium slowly, almost carefully, not fragile, just reverent, as if leaving a sacred place. The entire congregation rose to their feet without hesitation. Rows and rows of firefighters standing tall in silent respect. The sound of their boots echoed like thunder on the wooden floor. My husband froze, stunned by the collective gesture. His breath shuddered, overwhelmed in the most beautiful way. Then he bowed his head slightly, acknowledging them with humility. The room seemed to hold its breath around him. Every uniformed figure stood with shoulders squared and hearts open, not for the captain alone, but for the man who had just spoken with honesty and courage. My husband didn't see it as honor, he saw it as love, and that was what made the moment unforgettable. He walked back to me slowly, tears steady but peaceful. When he sat beside me again, I took his hand gently. His palm was warm, trembling but grounded. He leaned into me with a subtle shift of his shoulder, not collapsing, just seeking connection. "I didn't think I could do that," he whispered. His voice carried equal parts surprise and relief. "You did more than speak," I murmured back. "You honored him, and yourself." He closed his eyes for a moment, the truth sinking in. A small, tired smile touched his lips. "I feel lighter," he said, "like something inside me just unlocked." I squeezed his hand, feeling tears run quietly down my face. Today was grief, but it was also transformation. And he was finally allowing both. The final rituals of the service unfolded with deep reverence. The folded flag was presented to Harris's family. Bagpipes filled the church with a sound so mournful it felt alive. Firefighters saluted in unison, a wall of respect and unity. My husband stood with them, posture straight, eyes glistening. He looked like he belonged again, not because he wore a uniform, but because respect isn't fabric, it's legacy. He touched the patch in his pocket, pressing it against his heart. A silent message meant only for the man he'd lost. When the casket was carried out, he followed slowly, each step heavy, steady, grounded in love. Grief didn't crush him today. It shaped him into something stronger. Outside, at the graveside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Warm rays softened the cold air, falling gently across his face. He tilted his head upward, letting the light touch him. It felt symbolic, like a blessing, like release. He stood among his brothers, shoulder to shoulder. Their presence formed a circle of protection around him. Not pity, never pity, brotherhood, respect, shared history. He inhaled deeply, breath shaking but full. "This hurts," he whispered, "but it doesn't destroy me." I touched his arm gently, grounding him. He closed his eyes, leaning into the moment, and I knew he was saying goodbye, truly goodbye, not just for the man he lost, but for the version of himself he'd clung to for too long. When the ceremony ended, People came forward one by one, offering hugs, stories, memories, gratitude. My husband listened to each of them, not rushing, not withdrawing. His grief no longer something he hid, something he shared, honored, carried with dignity. "Your speech," one firefighter said softly. "It was exactly what we all needed." My husband lowered his gaze, humbled but steady. "Thank you," he said gently. He didn't brag. He didn't shrink. He simply existed with a quiet confidence reborn inside him. A confidence the fire hadn't destroyed, only buried. Now, finally, it was surfacing again, burning in a way that illuminated, not scorched. We walked back to the car slowly, the ground soft beneath our feet. My husband paused before opening the door, eyes drifting back to the grave. He touched the patch through his pocket, holding it there for a breath. "I'm ready," he whispered. The words weren't just for Harris. They were for himself, for the future he'd been afraid to face, for the life he was now willing to embrace fully. He looked at me with eyes clearer than I'd seen in years. Not free of sorrow, but free of the belief that sorrow defined him. "I'm okay," he said softly, and this time he wasn't trying to convince himself. He meant it. I opened the door for him, heart warm with pride. We drove away slowly, leaving flowers and sunlight behind, but carrying something far more lasting. Applause exploded around us, loud, long, and utterly genuine. It wasn't the polite clapping I'd heard at my sister's dinners. It was the kind that comes from people who understand the cost of a life. Firefighters stood, some whistling softly, others just clapping with shining eyes. My husband didn't move at first, stunned in his seat. Then he looked at me, eyes wide, vulnerable, searching. I nodded, tears blurring my vision, squeezing his hand. "You belong up there," I whispered. He rose slowly, every inch of him carrying history and healing. As he walked toward the stage, the applause didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, rolling through the room like a wave. The mayor stepped forward to meet him, hand outstretched, face warm. When their hands met, it felt like the universe correcting something, like a balance being restored that had been wrong for far too long. My husband stood in the light and didn't flinch. The mayor handed him a plaque, simple and dignified. I couldn't read the inscription from where I sat, but I didn't need to. I saw what it meant written all over my husband's face. He stared at it for a moment, his lips parting with disbelief. Then he bowed his head slightly, humbled beyond words. The mayor leaned in, saying something only he could hear. My husband nodded, emotion pooling in his eyes. When he turned to face the crowd, the applause slowly faded into silence. He stepped up to the microphone, fingers brushing its edge. This time, he didn't hesitate as long as he had at the funeral. "I never thought I'd be standing here again," he began softly. His voice carried through the room, gentle but clear. "Not as the man I used to be, but as the man I am now." My chest tightened at the honesty of that line. He wasn't trying to get his old life back anymore. He was claiming the one he'd built from its ashes. He spoke briefly, but every word landed with weight. He thanked the mayor, the community, the fire department. He talked about Harris without naming him, honoring his mentor subtly. He spoke of the privilege of serving, in uniform and out of it. He talked about the lives behind statistics, the families, the small moments. He didn't dramatize his injury or his pain. He simply acknowledged that it changed him and that he kept going anyway. "I thought my story ended the day I left the station," he said, "but I was wrong." He looked out over the crowd, and for the first time, I saw no fear. "Sometimes," he continued, "the hardest part of surviving is believing you still matter. And I hope anyone who's ever felt that way hears this clearly. You matter more than the title people gave you, or took away from you." His words hung in the air like a bridge for others to cross. When he walked back to his seat, the applause returned, warm and full. This time, though I didn't watch the crowd, I watched my family. My mother had tears streaming down her face openly now. My sister clapped with both hands, her jaw clenched in emotion. My brother's eyes were fixed on my husband, unreadable but intense. My uncle, the man of endless jokes, had his head bowed slightly. Shame and respect wrestled across his features. They weren't just seeing what the mayor saw. They were seeing what they had refused to see for years. My husband sat beside me again, breathing deeply. He leaned in just enough to brush his shoulder against mine. "You okay?" I whispered. He smiled, a small but completely genuine smile. "Yeah," he said. "For the first time, I think I really am." After the ceremony, people crowded the lobby, chatting in clusters. The air buzzed with congratulations and quiet emotional exhaustion. My husband spoke with firefighters, city staff, strangers who'd heard his story. He didn't shrink. He didn't apologize for taking up space. He listened just as much as he spoke, like he always did. And then I felt a presence at my side. My mother. She stood there, hands twisting the strap of her purse. Her eyes were red, mascara smudged at the corners. For once, she didn't seem concerned with fixing it. "I was wrong," she said without preamble. The words hit me harder than any argument we'd ever had. "I was so wrong about him." I swallowed, my throat suddenly too tight to answer. She looked toward my husband, her expression breaking. "I called him a failure in my head more times than I can count," she whispered. My sister joined us, arms folded, but face vulnerable. "I laughed at the jokes," she admitted. "I made some of them." There was no defensiveness, just remorse. "I didn't understand what he carried," she added. "I didn't want to understand." My brother came too, quieter than I'd seen him in years. "I envied him," he said simply. Then I convinced myself he'd fallen so I wouldn't feel small. My uncle edged in last, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't look at me. He looked at my husband. "Do you think he'd—" "Let me apologize," he muttered. It was the closest I had ever heard him come to humility. I took a breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "You should ask him yourself," I said, "because today it's not about what I think. It's about what he deserves." We walked over together, my husband mid-conversation with an old crew member. When he saw my family approaching as a group, his smile faltered slightly. Not out of fear, out of uncertainty. But he didn't step back. He didn't brace like he used to before dinners. He just straightened slowly, waiting for whatever came next. My mother spoke first, voice trembling but clear. "I owe you an apology," she said, hands shaking. "For years of disrespect I can't take back." My husband blinked, the words clearly startling him. "You were never a failed anything," she continued. You're one of the bravest men I've ever met." The honesty in her voice shook the ground beneath us. My husband swallowed hard, emotion flashing in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. He didn't rush to absolve her, but he didn't turn away either. My uncle stepped forward next, awkward as ever but changed. "I said cruel things I thought were jokes," he admitted. "They weren't jokes. They were me being a coward." He met my husband's gaze fully, no smirk in sight. "You did things I never had the guts to do," he said, "and then had the guts to start over when life hit you." He stuck out his hand, fingers trembling slightly. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then my husband reached out and took it, not with enthusiasm, but with measured grace. There was weight in that handshake, years of hurt, inches of progress. "I can't change what I said," my uncle murmured, "but I can shut my mouth and listen from now on." A tiny smile tugged at my husband's lips. "That's a good place to start," he replied. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, we sat on the couch. His plaque rested on the table, catching the soft lamplight. He leaned back, head against the cushion, eyes half closed. "I never needed them to worship me," he said. "I just needed them to stop tearing me down." I nodded, understanding in a way I hadn't before today. "And now?" I asked softly. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Now I know who I am," he said, "even if they forget again someday." He turned his head toward me, gaze steady and warm. "The mayor's speech helped," he added, "but the real change was inside me." He reached for my hand, lacing our fingers together. "And you're the reason I made it this far." We turned off the lights eventually, the house falling into gentle darkness. In the quiet, I thought about every step that led us here, the injury, the doubt, the cruel jokes at crowded tables, the funeral that broke him open and stitched him back stronger, the station that still remembered his name with reverence, the mayor's words that finally said what I'd been screaming in my heart. He wasn't just a failed firefighter. He was a man who walked through fire, lost almost everything, and kept going. A man who learned to save lives with his voice when his body couldn't anymore. A man who finally believed he was worthy of the life he still had. As he drifted to sleep beside me, his breathing deep and even, I smiled. They had tried to define him with a single cruel sentence. But that night, the city, the mayor, and his own heart rewrote it. Not with revenge, but with truth. And in the end, truth was the only recognition he ever really needed.